The night Celia Keene loaded her late husband's rifle and sat down at the kitchen table to wait for dawn, she had no idea that the man who would save her land was the same one she had spent 3 years praying would rot in a jail cell somewhere east of the Pecos. It was the autumn of 1883, and the Texas Panhandle was the kind of place that ate weak men alive and turned strong women into something harder than the caliche soil beneath their boots. Celia had turned 31 that past June, and she had the kind of beauty that the land had sharpened rather than softened dark copper hair that she wore pinned at the nape of her neck, brown eyes that missed nothing, and hands calloused from 2 years of running the Keene homestead alone since her husband Daniel had been thrown from his horse during a flash flood. The land itself was 240 acres of West Texas rangeland, not rich by any measure, but hers, with a creek that ran true even in dry summers and a small herd of cattle that she had built from nothing. The problem was a man named Silas Greer. Greer owned the Double Arrow Ranch to the north, a sprawling operation that had been swallowing smaller properties for years the way a drought swallows a shallow pond. He was 60 years old, broad across the chest, and he smiled in the way that men smile when they know they hold all the cards. He had been after the Keene land since before Daniel had died, and now that there was only a widow standing between him and that creek, he had decided that the legal route was the most expedient. His lawyer, a pale and narrow man named Whitfield Crane, had presented Celia with a document 3 weeks prior that claimed a lien against the Keene property dating back to a loan Daniel had allegedly taken from Greer in 1880. The amount was $420, and the due date on the document was October 14th, 1883. Tonight was October 13th. Celia had spent every waking hour since Crane handed her that document trying to prove it was forged. She had ridden to Amarillo twice. She had spoken to a circuit lawyer named Hollis Ford who had scratched his chin and told her the document looked legitimate enough to hold up before Judge Pemberton, who everyone in the county knew was friendly with Greer's money. She had written to the land office in Austin and received no reply. She had searched every inch of Daniel's papers, his ledger books, his old correspondence, and she had found nothing to contradict the lien and nothing to support it. $420. She had 63 in the house. Her nearest neighbor, a Tejano cattle rancher named Augusto Ruiz, had ridden over 2 days ago with what he could spare $12 and a brace of smoked hams. He had held his hat in both hands and told her he was sorry, and the sorrow in his eyes had been real enough that she had not cried until after she watched him ride back toward his own fence line. She had neighbors who brought what they could, and it amounted to nothing close to enough. So she sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's Winchester across her lap, and she watched the lamp burn, and she thought about what morning would bring. There was a sound outside. It was not the sound of wind, because the wind in the Panhandle had its own voice, and she knew it as well as she knew her own. This was something else, the deliberate quiet of a horse being walked slow, the way a man walks a horse when he does not want to be heard. Celia was on her feet, and at the window before the thought had fully formed, the rifle up in her finger near the trigger guard. The moon was high and cold, and in its light she could see a figure on horseback coming in off the western trail, picking a careful path through the mesquite. The horse was a big roan, the kind of animal that cost real money, and the man in the saddle sat with the particular ease of someone who had spent more of his life on a horse than off one. He wore a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat, and as he came closer and the lamp light from the window caught the angles of his face, Celia felt something cold drop through the center of her chest. She knew that face. She knew it the way you know the face of someone you have rehearsed hating for a long time. Emmett Hartwell. She was at the door before he had reached the hitching post, and she had the rifle leveled at him through the 2-inch gap between the door and its frame. "You ride right back the way you came," she said, and her voice was steady because she had decided long ago that she would never let Emmett Hartwell see her shake. He reined the roan to a stop and held both hands up, easy and unhurried, the way a man does when he has been had at gunpoint often enough that it no longer frightens him. He was 34 years old, lean and dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the canyon walls to the west. His eyes, even in the bad light, were the particular gray-green of creek water in shadow, and they found the gap in her door with unsettling precision. "Evening, Celia," he said. "It is not a good evening, and you are not welcome on this property. Get gone." "I heard you've got trouble," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had no business being as calm as it was when a rifle was pointed at him. "My trouble is none of your concern. I've got something for you." He reached slowly into his coat pocket and she tightened her grip on the rifle, and he paused and met her eyes through the gap and said, "Paper. Just paper, Celia. I am reaching for paper." She did not lower the rifle, but she did not shoot either, and he took that as permission enough to pull a folded document from his breast pocket and hold it up so the moonlight hit it. "Come out and look at it," he said. "You come closer and put it on the step." "If I come closer, you are going to shoot me." "That depends on what is on that paper." There was a pause, and then the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile, and he nudged the roan forward 3 careful steps and leaned down from the saddle and set the folded paper on the top porch step with the deliberate care of a man leaving an offering. Then he backed the horse off and held his hands up again. Celia opened the door just wide enough to reach down and take the paper without fully stepping out, keeping the rifle against her hip. She unfolded it in the lamp light that spilled through the door. For a long moment she did not breathe. It was the deed to the Keene homestead, all 240 acres, registered with the Randall County Land Office, dated correctly and stamped with the county seal. And in the space for the lien holder, where Silas Greer's name should have been written, there was no name at all, because the document in her hand was a clean deed, clear of encumbrance, the way Daniel had always told her it was before whatever Greer's lawyer had conjured had muddied those waters. She stared at it long enough that Emmett lowered his hands and let them rest on the saddle horn. "Where did you get this?" she said. "That is a long story. You had better start telling it." He looked at the rifle still at her hip and then back at her face and said, "Could I get down off this horse first? I have been riding since early afternoon." Celia looked at the document again, then at him and said, "You tie that horse at the post and you come to the door. You do not step inside until I say so." "Yes, ma'am," he said, without irony, and dismounted. She had known Emmett Hartwell for the better part of 6 years, though she had spent most of those years actively working to avoid knowing him any better. He had come through this part of the Panhandle in the summer of 1877, a few years before Daniel died, riding with a loose outfit of men that the county sheriff had been watching for some months. Nobody had pinned anything specific on Emmett in those days, but the men he ran with had a reputation that preceded them like a bad-smell cattle, moving across county lines without the right bills of sale, money changing hands in ways that did not track with any legitimate operation. Daniel had done business with one of those men, a horse trader named Cole Yates, who turned out to be less of a trader and more of a thief, and Emmett Hartwell had been standing in the yard when the sheriff had ridden out to ask Daniel some pointed questions. Daniel had been cleared of any wrongdoing. He had been genuinely deceived by Yates. But the day of that visit had been one of the worst of Celia's life, and Emmett Hartwell had been standing in their yard when it happened, and she had never quite separated the man from the memory. Then, in 1880, there had been the incident at the Buckhorn Saloon in Mobedy. Emmett had been involved in something. The details were foggy because accounts varied depending on who was telling the story. But the result was that a man had been shot, and Emmett had ridden out of Mobedy in a hurry, and the word that came back was that he was living somewhere outside the law's easy reach, which in 1883 still meant quite a lot of territory. Daniel had told her once, in the last year of his life, that Emmett Hartwell was not as bad a man as people thought. Celia had not agreed then, and she had not revised her opinion since. He came to the door with his hat in his hand, which surprised her, and he stood on the step where the lamplight could find him fully, and she looked at him with the rifle still present and said, "Talk." He talked. He had been in Tascosa, he said, which was the rough town on the Canadian River about a day's ride north, where the cattle drives from the south met the trading routes from the east and all manner of men passed through. He had been doing some work there. He was careful about what exactly he called that work, and she noticed the carefulness when he had heard Whitfield Crane talking in the back room of a saloon. Crane had been celebrating, apparently, having a drink with a man Emmett recognized as one of Greer's hired hands, and Crane had been talking freely enough that Emmett had heard enough to understand what was happening. He was bragging, Emmett said, his jaw tight, about how he had filed a forged lien against a widow's property, and she had no way to disprove it in time. He was laughing about it. "Called you?" He stopped, and his expression shifted into something hard and flat. "He said some things I will not repeat." Celia kept her face still. "Go on." "I knew this land," Emmett said. "I knew Daniel, I knew what was right. And I knew that Crane was talking about a forged document because I happen to know how those get made and what they look like." "Because you've made them," Celia said. He met her eyes and did not flinch. "Because I have seen them made. That is a different thing, though I do not expect you to believe it." "You are right that I do not." "That is fair." He said it without self-pity, which she found unexpectedly disarming. "What I did next is what matters. I rode to Tascosa's land office the following morning with enough information to convince the clerk, a man I know, to check the original county filing. The Keene deed was registered clean in 1877 when Daniel filed it. No lien. Greer's man filed the lien document separately through a different county office in Canyon, counting on the fact that you would not have the time or the connections to untangle it before the deadline. How did you get the clean deed? He was quiet for a moment. I paid the clerk to make a certified copy of the original registration. She looked at him sharply. Paid him how? With money, Celia, legal tender. And the money came from where? Another pause, shorter this time. I had a good summer. She decided not to press that thread, because the document in her hands was real and the county seal was authentic, and she had spent enough time looking at legal papers in the past 3 weeks to know what a legitimate copy looked like. The question of where Emmett Hartwell's money came from was a question for another time. "Come in," she said, stepping back from the door. He looked surprised. She noticed that too. She set the rifle against the wall, within arm's reach, and put the document on the table under the lamp and sat down across from it. He came inside and stood just past the threshold, turning his hat in both hands, and looked around the room with the careful expression of a man who was not sure where his welcome ended. The kitchen was modest and very clean. There was a cast iron stove, a dry sink, shelves of preserved food in glass jars, a braided rug on the plank floor, a table with 4 chairs. On the wall near the window was a small framed photograph of a man and woman taken on a bright day. Daniel and Celia, perhaps 5 years prior. Daniel squinting against the sun and smiling. Celia looking straight at the camera with a directness that the camera had caught exactly right. Emmett looked at that photograph for a moment and then looked away. "Sit down," she said. He sat across from her, setting his hat on the table beside him. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove because she had been awake all night and she was going to be awake the rest of it, and she set one in front of him and he accepted it with a nod. For a moment neither of them spoke. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why did you come here? You could have sent the document with anyone. You could have sent it with Augusto Ruiz when he rides past Tascosa on his next drive. You could have left it with the sheriff. Why did you bring it yourself and ride through the night to do it?" He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the steam rising from it, and there was something in his face that was not evasion but was, she thought, a man deciding carefully how much of a true thing to say. "Because I wanted to make sure it got here," he said at last. "That is not all of it." He looked up at her. "No," he said, "it is not." The lamp burned between them and the night pressed against the windows, and outside the roan moved at the hitching post. The clock on the shelf read 11:15. Daniel was a good man, Emmett said. He was fair to me when he had no reason to be and considerable reason not to be. I never forgot that. Daniel is gone. I know it. He said it quietly and without looking away from her. I know it, Celia. She looked down at her coffee. You did not come to his funeral. No. Were you in trouble then? I was always in trouble then, he said, and there was something wry in it, but something honest underneath the wry. I could not come without bringing that trouble with me, and I did not think that was a gift you needed at a funeral. She thought about that for a moment. It was, she realized, a more considerate reason than she would have credited him with. What kind of work are you doing now? She asked. The kind that is better not to describe in detail to a woman who just had a rifle pointed at me. I put the rifle down. You put it against the wall where you can get to it in 2 steps. She almost smiled at that. She caught it before it reached her face, but she felt it, and she thought perhaps he saw it too because something shifted in his expression. I am trying, he said carefully, to do better work than I have done. It is not a fast process. Are you wanted by the law right now? He considered this with more seriousness than she expected. Not currently, he said. There are some old matters that have not been formally resolved, but there is nothing current. Old matters meaning the Mobity business. Among others, someone was shot. Yes. Did you shoot him? His gray-green eyes were steady. I did not. That is the honest answer, and I understand if you do not believe it. She studied him across the table. He did not look away and did not fidget and did not add anything to the answer, all of which she found she could not entirely discount. Men who were lying usually talked more, in her experience. They filled the silence with explanation. I believe you, she said, and surprised herself by meaning it. He looked at her for a moment as if that too had surprised him. She pulled the document across the table and read it again, more carefully this time. The original filing date, the acreage description, matching Daniel's original survey perfectly. The county seal with its embossed edge, the signature of the Tascosa land office clerk. Will this hold, she said, against what Greer's lawyer filed? It should, Emmett said. The original registration predates the lien filing by 3 years. Any judge who is not in Greer's pocket will see it. And Pemberton is in Greer's pocket, she said flatly. Pemberton will not be the judge. She looked up. I also, Emmett said, setting his coffee cup down with a deliberate care, sent a letter to the district court in Amarillo. The kind of letter that explains that a forged lien is being used to fraudulently seize a widow's homestead in Randolph County, and that the county judge has a financial relationship with the man doing the seizing. He paused. That letter had some specific names and some specific dollar amounts in it. Celia stared at him. How do you know about Pemberton and Greer? Tascosa is a small town, he said. Men talk. I listen. She set her own cup down slowly and looked at him with a different quality of attention than she had been giving him. This was not the look she gave a man she was deciding whether to trust. This was the look she gave a thing she was trying to understand from a new angle. You have been planning this, she said. This is not something you put together in an afternoon. He did not answer immediately. Emmett. I heard about the lien 2 weeks ago, he said. When I heard Crane talking in Tascosa, it was not the first I knew of it. I had been watching Greer's operation for a while. He has done this to other people. A Mexican family south of here lost their land to him 3 years ago by the same method. An older widow up near Palo Duro lost a parcel of creek land. He finds people who cannot fight back, and he files paper against them and he waits. Something shifted in Celia's chest, not a softening exactly, but a reorientation, the way a compass needle reorients when you turn it toward true north. Why were you watching Greer's operation? He looked at his hands. Because he is the kind of man I have a particular dislike for, he said quietly. Men who use paper and lawyers to do what they are too cowardly to do directly. They are worse, in my view, than the men who rob you on the road. At least those men are honest about what they are doing. It occurred to Celia, sitting across the table from a man she had decided to hate years ago, that people were very difficult to hold in the shapes you cut out for them. She had cut an Emmett Hartwell shape that was a certain size and a certain darkness, and the man sitting across from her did not fit it at all, and she was not sure whether to be angry about that or something else. "You are staying until morning," she said. It came out as a statement rather than a question or an invitation, and she was not entirely sure how she meant it. He looked at her carefully. "I do not want to cause you trouble. You have already caused me enough trouble for one lifetime. A few more hours will not make a significant difference." She stood and went to the stove. "There is leftover beans and cornbread. Eat something." He ate because he had clearly not eaten much that day, and because the food was on the table in front of him, and she sat across from him and they talked. Not carefully, the way two people talk when they are managing each other, but actually talked, the way people do when it is late and the crisis has not fully resolved but the worst of the fear has eased, and you are simply two human beings in a small, warm room with the dark outside. He told her about the Mexican family south of Randall County, the Fuentes family, who had come north from Chihuahua 20 years prior and built their ranch from bare ground, and who had lost it to a lien that Greer's people had manufactured from a badly worded old debt. The father had tried to fight it, and had been visited by two of Greer's men in a way that ended the fight without any legal proceedings at all. They were in New Mexico now, starting over, which was a brutality so ordinary in that time and place that it barely made the papers. Nobody helped them, Celia said. Nobody who could. He said it without self-justification. I did not know about it until it was done. She thought about the Fuentes family while she poured more coffee. She thought about how the land out here had a way of chewing through people's lives, and how much of that chewing was done by men like Greer using legal instruments that should have protected people but were shaped by money into weapons instead. She thought about Augusto Ruiz riding over with $12 and a brace of smoked hams and the sorrow in his eyes, because he knew what happened to people who could not hold their land. "You are angry," Emmett said. "I am always angry," she said. "I have been angry since Daniel died, and I figured out how alone you are as a widow in this territory. The law is not built for women who own things. It is built for men who want to take them." He was quiet for a moment. "That is true," he said, without the kind of awkward qualification she had heard from other men when she said things like this, the well-meaning but still, or the granted but just, "that is true." She looked at him across the table. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Before, the way you were running." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My father had a farm in Missouri," he said at last. "Good land, river bottom land. He died when I was 17 and left it to my mother and my two sisters. A man in town had held a note on the farm, a legitimate note, not forged but held with a lot of interest attached, and when my father died, that man called the note. We could not pay it. We lost the farm in the summer of 1866. He paused. "I was angry in the particular way that boys are angry when they cannot fix things, and I made some choices I cannot undo. And then the choices I had already made meant that the straight road was no longer available to me, and I kept going on the crooked one because it was the only road I had." Celia sat with that for a moment. "Your mother and sisters," she said. "My mother is in Kansas City now, with my eldest sister and her husband. They are well enough." Something crossed his face. "I send money. Legitimately got money." He looked at her, and this time he did smile just slightly, the kind of smile that acknowledged a hit. "More legitimately than it used to be," he said. She shook her head, but she felt something move in her chest that was not anger and was not pity either. It was something closer to recognition, the particular feeling of understanding how a person got from one place to another place, even when you could see all the wrong turns they had taken. The clock moved toward midnight and then past it. The lamp burned low, and she trimmed it. He helped her clear the table without being asked, and she dried the cups and put them back on the shelf, and outside the wind had come up, the way it always did in the Panhandle after midnight, an insistent low moan through the mesquite. "You should sleep," he said. "You have a long day tomorrow. Greer's man will come in the morning." "Crane." "Yes, what time?" He said 10 o'clock. Emmett nodded. "I will be there." She turned from the shelf and looked at him. "You do not need to be." I know I do not need to be. His voice was quiet and without drama. I want to be. She studied his face in the lamplight. The lines of it were harder than they might have been if his life had gone a different way, but there was nothing in it that she recognized as dishonesty or manipulation. What she saw was something simpler and more complicated at the same time. A man who was trying, slowly and imperfectly, to become something better than what circumstances and his own anger had made him, and who had tonight done something very concrete toward that end. "The spare room is off the hall," she said. "There are blankets in the chest." He looked at her for a moment as if making sure he had heard her right. "Thank you," he said. It came out with a plainness that made it weigh more than it would have if he had dressed it up. She nodded and took the lamp and went to her room, and she lay down on top of the quilt with her boots still on, as she had been doing for the past 3 weeks, and she stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the wind work its way around the corners of the house and thought about many things. She thought about Daniel, who had been a good and steady man, and who she had loved in the particular way that you love someone who is good and steady with gratitude and comfort and a quiet satisfaction, not the kind of love that burns your thinking down, but the kind that is warm and reliable like a good stove in winter. She had been lucky to have it, and she had grieved it honestly. She thought about the deed folded on the table, and the letter that Emmett said was already on its way to the district court in Amarillo. She thought about Emmett Hartwell, asleep or not sleeping in the spare room down the hall, who had ridden through the night with a piece of paper that could save everything she had left, and about whom she did not know what to think except that she had clearly been thinking about him wrong. She was asleep before she meant to be. She woke to gray pre-dawn light and the smell of coffee, and for one disoriented moment she thought Daniel was in the kitchen, and then reality settled over her like the morning cold, and she lay there for a breath, and then got up and straightened her clothes and went out. Emmett was at the stove, which she had not expected. He had found the coffee and the good cast iron pot, and he had the fire going with an efficiency that meant he was used to making his own fires in unknown kitchens, which was a thought she did not follow too far down. He turned when she came in and looked at her, and she must have looked the way she felt, because he said, "You slept about 4 hours," and handed her a cup. "That is more than I have had most nights recently," she said, and sat down at the table. The sky through the window was the particular blue-black of pre-dawn Texas sky, the kind that made the stars look close enough to touch and the horizon feel very far away. The wind had died down and the morning was still. "How are we going to do this?" she said. "Calmly," he said, sitting across from her with his own cup. "When Crane arrives, you let him do his speaking. You let him present his document. Then you present the certified copy of the original deed and you ask him to explain the discrepancy. He will try to bluster. You do not respond to the blustering. You tell him that a letter has already been forwarded to the district court in Amarillo detailing the fraudulent nature of the lien and the relationship between Judge Pemberton and Silas Greer, and that if he wishes to proceed he may do so at considerable personal risk to himself. And if he calls that bluff—" "It is not a bluff," Emmett said. "The letter is real. I sent it 4 days ago by way of a reliable hand." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You sent it 4 days ago." "Yes." "Before you had the certified deed copy." "Yes." She set the cup down. "You were doing this in parts. You were running several threads at once." "I wanted to make sure at least one of them held," he said simply. She thought about that, about a man sitting in Tascosa, running careful parallel plans to save land that was not his and protect a woman who had told him, on the last occasion they had spoken, that she wanted nothing to do with him. It was the kind of thing that required sustained attention and genuine intent, and those were not qualities she had previously associated with Emmett Hartwell. "Why did you not come to me when you first found out?" she said. "You had 2 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup between his hands. "I did not know if you would listen," he said, "and I wanted to come to you with something concrete, not with a warning that might make things worse by putting Greer on alert." He paused. And I will be honest with you, I was not sure I was welcome here. You were not, she said. 3 weeks ago you were not. And now? She looked at him across the table in the growing light. This man she had spent years categorizing as one thing, and who had spent at least 2 weeks being something else entirely. And she said, I am revising my position. Something in his face shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was more like the expression of a man who has been cold for a long time and is only now becoming aware that he is standing somewhere warm. They sat with their coffee as the sky outside began to lighten from black to dark blue to the gray rose of early October dawn in Texas, which is one of the more quietly beautiful things that exists in that part of the world. The way the flat land seems to catch the first light before the sun even appears, turning the buffalo grass silver and the mesquite a pale, soft green. Celia went out to check on her cattle and Emmett watered his roan from the trough and walked the fence line with her. 2 lengths of fence post that had come loose in the last wind and needed resetting. She brought the tools from the barn and he worked the post back into the ground with a matter-of-fact competence that told her he had built and repaired fence many times, which meant somewhere in his history there were honest working hands even before the crooked road. Tell me something true, she said, while he tamped the earth around the second post. He looked up. About what? About yourself. Something I would not expect. He thought about it for a moment, leaning on the tamping rod. Above them the sky was now fully light, a pale washed blue, and a hawk was working a thermal over the creek to the east. I keep a garden, he said. She stared at him. A garden. Wherever I stay for more than a month, he said, and there was the faintest trace of self-consciousness in it which she found unexpectedly endearing. I have always kept a kitchen garden, tomatoes and beans and whatever will grow. It was my mother's thing and I suppose I picked it up. He paused. It is not something that fits the reputation. She laughed. It came out before she had authorized it, a real laugh, not polite and not managed, and he looked at her with an expression that was almost startled, as if he had not expected the sound of it. A garden, she said again, shaking her head. You asked for something you would not expect, he said. I did, she said, and that qualifies. They walked back to the house, and the morning light was full on the land by the time they reached the porch, and she stood with her hands on the rail and looked out at her 240 acres, the creek glinting in the east, the cattle moving slow and content toward the water, the sky enormous and pale and specifically hers, and she thought that she would burn the whole thing down before she gave it to Silas Greer. Whitfield Crane arrived at 9:45, which meant he had wanted to appear early and efficient, and he came in his black buggy with Greer's man riding behind him on a paint horse. The Greer man's name was Adley Boggs, and he had the particular quality of stillness that hired intimidation usually carries, the stillness of a man who is being paid to stand where he is and look like trouble. Celia met them on the porch with her hands in her apron pockets and a deliberately neutral expression on her face. Behind her, the screen door opened and Emmett stepped out and stood beside her, and she felt, without looking at him, the quality of his presence solid and unhurried and entirely unruffled by the appearance of Boggs or his intention. Crane stopped when he saw Emmett. His narrow face went through several quick expressions, landing eventually on a careful blankness. Mrs. Keene, he said, not stepping down from the buggy. Mr. Crane, she said, I see you have company. I do. Crane's eyes moved to Emmett and a calculation happened behind those pale eyes. Hartwell, he said. Crane, Emmett said, with the pleasantness of a man who is entirely comfortable and who has no intention of allowing the other party to set the tone. Crane descended from the buggy with his leather satchel and came to the foot of the porch steps. Boggs stayed on his horse. His hand was near his pistol in the way that was meant to be noticed. You can take your hand off that iron, Emmett said to Boggs, without looking at him, in a tone that was conversational and absolute. Boggs looked at him for a moment, and then his hand moved to the saddle horn. Celia looked at Crane and said, You have a document to present. Crane recovered his manner. which was the manner of a man who had learned to use legal language as a kind of armor, and he produced the lien document from his satchel with the ceremony of someone who believes they hold all the cards and wants that belief witnessed. This lien, dated April of 1880, he began, represents a legitimate debt of $420 owed by the late Daniel Keene to Silas Greer, and per the terms of the filing, the debt is now due and, in the absence of payment, Mr. Crane, Celia said. He paused. She took the certified deed copy from her apron pocket and held it out. He looked at it without taking it. She walked down one step and held it closer and said, "Take it and read it." He took it. She watched his face while he read it. The careful blankness developed a crack along one edge. "This is a certified copy of the original Keene homestead deed, filed with the Randall County Land Office in 1877, she said. "The original registration, Mr. Crane, no lien, clean title." Now you can explain to me how a lien that was filed 3 years after that original clean registration can supersede it. The filing process is fraudulent, Emmett said from the porch above them, still in that same conversational tone. The lien you are holding was filed through the Canyon office specifically to avoid detection, and the debt it claims to represent does not appear in Daniel Keene's ledger books at any point in their 6-year history. Additionally, he continued, and now his voice had taken on a quality that was quieter and for that reason more serious, a letter detailing the nature of the fraud, the financial relationship between your client and Judge Pemberton, and the specific mechanism by which similar fraudulent liens were previously used to dispossess the Fuentes family in 1880, has been forwarded to the district court in Amarillo. That letter arrived, I expect, approximately 2 days ago. Crane was very still. "You would want to think carefully about your next several steps," Emmett said. "Greer has some reach here in the county. He does not have reach into the district court, and once the district court begins asking questions, Pemberton will have his own troubles to manage. Men in Pemberton's position have a strong tendency to become very cooperative with district authorities when they see the alternative clearly." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Boggs, on his paint horse, was looking at Crane in a way that suggested even Greer's hired man could see which way the wind was blowing. Crane folded the certified copy with precise movements and held it out to Celia. She took it. "This is not the final word on the matter," he said, with the reflexive defiance of a man who has lost his position but has not yet admitted it to himself. "No," Celia said, "but it is the word that will reach Amarillo first, and you and Mr. Greer both know what that means." She held the deed against her chest and looked at Crane with the full measure of everything she had felt in the past 3 weeks, the fear and the grief and the fury and the sleepless nights. "This is my land," she said. "It was my husband's land, and now it is mine, and it will stay mine. And if Silas Greer sends anyone else to my door with paper or without it, I will make sure the district court has an even clearer picture than it already does." Crane put his satchel under his arm and turned and walked back to his buggy without another word. Boggs turned his paint horse and followed, and they went back down the western trail the way they had come, and Celia stood on her porch step and watched them go until the dust settled. Then she let out a long breath that she felt had been stored in her chest for 3 weeks. Emmett came down the steps and stood beside her, not touching her, just present, the way solid things are present. "It is done," she said. "The Amarillo business will take some time," he said, "but yes, the immediate threat is done." She turned and looked at him in the full morning light, which was honest and clear and left nothing in shadow, and she saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes that she had missed in the lamplight. He had not slept, she realized. He had not slept at all. He had sat up the whole night making sure. "You need to sleep," she said. "I need to ride to Tascosa," he said. "Not before you sleep." She said it with the matter-of-fact firmness she had learned in 2 years of telling cattle what to do. "Go sleep. The spare room. 2 hours at least." He looked at her and something shifted in his expression again, that thing she had seen before in the kitchen, the quality of warmth where there had been cold. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said, echoing his own words back at him from the night before. "Go." He went. She sat on the porch in the October sun and read through the deed one more time and thought about what came next. She needed to write to the land office herself with a formal statement. She needed to speak with Hollis Ford, the circuit lawyer, and have him review the certified copy. She needed to keep Augusto Ruiz informed. And she needed to write to the district court in Amarillo to make sure Emmett's letter had a response waiting for it. These were all things she could do. She had always known what to do. The problem in the past 3 weeks had been the lack of the right tool, and now she had it. She thought about the man asleep in her spare room, who had spent at least 2 weeks building her that tool without her knowledge or consent, and she felt something that was complicated in the best way. Emmett slept for almost 4 hours, which told her more than anything else how tired he had been, because she did not think he was a man who easily surrendered himself to sleep in someone else's house. When he came out to the kitchen, she had food on the table, the good smoked ham from Augusto's gift, fried with eggs and fresh cornbread, and she made him sit and eat before she let him think about his horse. "You are a bossy woman," he said, but he sat and he ate, and he said it without any real objection in his voice. "I am an efficient woman," she corrected. "There is a difference." "I do not dispute the difference," he said. They ate, and the afternoon light came through the south window and lay across the table in a long, warm rectangle. And outside, the cattle were moving slowly, and the hawk was back at the creek, and the Panhandle was doing what it did best, which was being large and silent and very beautiful in its specific austere way. "What will you do now?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "There is some unfinished business in Tascosa," he said. "And then I do not know. The unfinished business is the legitimate kind or the other kind. Increasingly the legitimate kind," he said. "I have been taking on some work scouting for a cattle operation out of Amarillo. Legitimate pay for legitimate work." "Is that enough for you?" she asked. After the other kind, he thought about it honestly, which was something she had noticed he did. He did not give answers quickly, he actually considered. "It is satisfying in a different way," he said. "The work you can be proud of sits differently in your chest than the other kind. The other kind you get used to not thinking about. This kind," he paused, "you can think about." She nodded slowly. "Stay," she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not qualify what she had said, because she had decided that she was done with the habit of walking back things she meant. "Stay for a few days. The fence line needs work, and I have not gotten the winter preparations done, and there is a section of the barn roof that needs—" "Celia," he said. "What? Are you asking me to stay because you need help with the barn or because you want me to stay?" The afternoon light was very honest. She looked at him across the table and said, "Both." He was quiet for a breath, and then he said, "All right, just that, all right. And then, after a moment, the barn roof first, I think, before the weather turns." She smiled at that, a real one, and he looked at her with the same expression he had worn when she laughed about the garden, the slightly startled look of a man encountering something he had not let himself expect. He stayed. 3 days became 5, and 5 became a week, and the week was one of the most quietly extraordinary of Celia's life in the way that significant things are often quiet, full of small moments that turn out to matter. He fixed the barn roof and the fence, and he helped her with the cattle sorting, and he split more firewood than she would need all winter. And in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked, or in the kitchen with the lamp between them. And she learned him the way you learn a person when you are actually paying attention. She learned that he had a dry, precise humor that he deployed carefully, as if he was not entirely sure it was welcome. She learned that he had an extensive knowledge of cattle and horses that was far more detailed than a man who had only ever moved cattle dishonestly would possess, which meant there had been honest work somewhere in his history too. She learned that he was patient in the specific way of a man who had learned patience out of necessity, and that beneath the patience was a temper he kept under very deliberate control. She learned that he had a habit of fixing things, not just the things she asked him to fix, but the things he noticed on his own: a loose hinge on the cellar door, a section of fence that was only slightly off but would not hold a hard winter, and that this habit was so ingrained he barely seemed aware of it. She learned that he watched her when she was not looking, and that when she caught him at it, he did not look away. On the fifth evening, Augusto Ruiz rode over with his eldest son, having heard somehow the way news moves in the Panhandle, which is sideways and without obvious channels, that the crisis was over. He accepted a cup of coffee and looked at Emmett with the careful assessment of a man who is protective of a neighbor he respects, and Emmett looked back at him without defensiveness and said, "I know your cousin in Tascosa. He speaks well of you." Augusto's expression shifted. "Rodrigo," he said. "He told me about the Fuentes family," Emmett said. "I am sorry that happened. I am sorry nobody stopped it." There was a pause, and then Augusto nodded slowly, and the quality of his assessment of Emmett changed in a way that Celia noted with satisfaction. Augusto was a good judge of men. She had always trusted his reading of people. After Augusto and his son rode back in the evening dark, Emmett sat on the porch step with his coffee and looked out at the land and said, "He is a good man." "He is," Celia said, "the best neighbor I have." "You have good neighbors," Emmett said. "The $12 and the hams." "He brought what he had," she said. "That is what good neighbors do," he said quietly. She sat down on the step beside him, a little closer than she had been sitting in previous evenings, and the night air had the real cold in it now, the kind that means November is not far off, and the stars were enormous overhead. "Emmett," she said. "Yes." "What happened at Mobedy?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive quiet, but the quiet of a man settling into a difficult story. "There was a man named Ferris," he said. "He ran an operation that I was loosely connected to at the time. The kind of operation I should not have been involved with at all. He shot a man, a bartender who had not given him any trouble at all, a Mexican man named Santiago, and the blame came down on everyone in his orbit. I was close enough in the orbit that I ran, because running was the choice I had. If I had stayed and tried to explain myself, I would have been in a Mobedy jail for something I did not do, and Ferris's connections meant that the jail was where I would have stayed." Celia listened. "Santiago lived," Emmett said. "He lost the use of his arm, but he lived. Ferris eventually got caught in New Mexico for something unrelated and is in prison there now. The case in Mobedy is technically open, but nobody is actively working it because the man who was shot has long since moved south and nobody else has much interest." He paused. "I sent Santiago money when I could find where he was, not as much as I should have." "But you sent it," she said. "It does not balance the accounts." "No," she said, "but it is what you did." They sat in the dark, and the stars moved overhead the way they always do, slowly and enormously, and after a while he said, "I would like to stay longer than a few days." She looked at the stars. "How much longer?" "I do not know exactly," he said. "That depends somewhat on what you want." She turned and looked at him. His face in the starlight was the face she had been looking at for a week now, and she had stopped seeing it as something unfamiliar and had started seeing it as something she would notice the absence of. "What do you want?" she said. He turned to look at her, and in the dark his gray-green eyes were very direct. "I think you know what I want," he said quietly. "I am not going to push you toward it, but I would be dishonest if I said it was nothing." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had ridden through the night with a piece of paper, who kept a garden and sent money to a man he had inadvertently wronged, who fixed things without being asked, and who did not look away when she asked him hard questions. She reached over and put her hand on his, which was resting on the step between them. He went very still. Then he turned his hand over and held hers, carefully, the way you hold something you are not sure you are entitled to hold. "I am still making up my mind," she said honestly, "but I am not making it up in the direction I thought I was." "I can live with that," he said. She laughed, and he did too, both of them sitting on the porch step in the cold starlight holding hands like people who have earned something difficult. The letter from the district court in Amarillo arrived 9 days later, carried by the regular mail rider out of Canyon. It was addressed to Celia Keene, and was formal in the way of official correspondence, but its substance was clear. The district court was opening an inquiry into the lien filing against the Keene property, and into Judge Pemberton's financial relationship with Silas Greer. Celia was asked to make herself available for a deposition at her convenience, and in the meantime the lien was suspended pending investigation. She read it twice at the kitchen table with Emmett standing at the stove, and then she said, "It is done." He turned around. "The inquiry is open," she said. "The lien is suspended." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she stood up, and he put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face, and she looked at his, and what she saw there was everything she needed to see: relief that was not about the land at all, and something else, something that had been building for days and was now clearly visible on both sides. She put her hands on his chest and felt the solid warmth of him and said, "You can kiss me if you want to." "I very much want to," he said. He kissed her with the same deliberate care with which he did everything, not rushed, not hesitant, but fully present, and she felt it the way you feel something that is exactly right in the way things only sometimes are, and her hands moved up and held his face, and outside the wind moved through the mesquite, and the cattle stood in the October sun, and the land was hers, and the morning was clear and wide open. They were a little breathless when they stopped. "Well," Emmett said. "Yes," she agreed. He laughed, and she felt it under her hands, and she stepped back and smoothed her apron in the automatic way of a person who is managing a very large feeling by doing a very small thing. "The deposition," she said. "I need to write to Holly's Ford." "I will help you draft the letter," he said, and he was smiling at her in a way that was new, or not new exactly, but less guarded than it had been. He stayed. He did not announce a departure date, and she did not ask for one, and the days moved in the way they do on working land, full of physical labor and small satisfactions, and the particular companionship of 2 people who are learning the shape of each other's daily life. He helped her through the last of the fall preparations, the garden put to bed, the root cellar stocked, the firewood properly stacked against the winter, the cattle sorted, and the weaker animals given closer care. He was good with the cattle. Better than good, actually, with the instinctive ease of someone who has spent real time learning them, and she watched him work and thought about all the things she had assumed about a man she had never properly looked at. Augusto Ruiz came over again in early November with some extra seed corn and stayed for supper, and he and Emmett talked cattle for 2 hours after dinner in the way that men who are both genuinely interested in cattle can do indefinitely, and Celia sat nearby and listened and felt something that was new in her chest, something warm and specific. She was happy, not the quiet, reliable happiness she had had with Daniel, which she would always value and never dishonor. Something different. Something with more heat in it, more awareness, more of the quality she associated with standing at the edge of something large and real and choosing to step forward. She told Emmett, on a cold November evening when they were sitting by the stove, about Daniel. Not just the facts, but the actual texture of the marriage, the goodness of it, the steadiness, the loss of it. She told him about the 6 months after Daniel died, when she had been so afraid she had barely slept, had barely eaten, had run the ranch on something that was closer to pure survival instinct than anything else. She told him about the night she had sat in this same chair and decided that she would not give up, that the land was hers and she would hold it whatever it cost. He listened. He did not try to respond to every piece of it. He just listened, and when she was done he said, "You are one of the strongest people I know." She shook her head. "I did what I had to." "That is what strong people always say," he said. "Weak people say they had no choice. Strong people say they did what they had to. The difference is that strong people understand they had a choice and they made it." She looked at him across the stove's warmth and said, "I did not expect to find you interesting." "I gathered," he said dryly. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know," he said. "I am taking it as one." The Greer situation resolved itself over the following month with the particular mechanical thoroughness of legal processes once they gain momentum. Judge Pemberton, faced with a district inquiry and the specific financial records that Emmett's letter had introduced, made the predictable choice of men in his position and cooperated fully. The forged lien was formally invalidated. Silas Greer was assessed significant legal penalties, and more importantly, the fraudulent lien mechanism he had used against the Fuentes family, and the Palo Duro widow was also reopened. Greer did not go to prison. The law in 1883 Texas had limits in that direction, but he paid fines that cost him, and the district court's scrutiny meant that his days of using paper to dispossess his neighbors were effectively over. Hollis Ford wrote to Celia with the news in December, in a letter that was professionally formal but had a tone of real satisfaction underneath it. She read it aloud at the kitchen table and Emmett listened, and when she was done he said simply, "Good." She folded the letter and set it down and looked at him. "What are your plans," she said, "for today or in general?" "In general." He was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to recognize as genuine consideration rather than evasion. "I have been talking to the Amarillo cattle operation," he said. "The scouting work. They want me to take on a more formal role, route planning, water sources, that kind of thing. It is honest work and it pays decently." "And where would that work be based?" "Here mostly," he said. "The routes all run through the Panhandle." He paused. "If I had a place here." She met his eyes. "Emmett," she said, "yes. Are you asking if you can stay?" "I am asking," he said carefully, "whether you want me to stay. Those are different things." She looked at him across the table, this man who had become so ordinary in her daily life that she could no longer clearly imagine the daily life without him, and she said, "I want you to stay." Something moved through his face, relief, and something warmer than relief, something that had been waiting for this specific permission. "Then I will stay," he said. Christmas came to the Panhandle the way it always did, cold and clear and very quiet, with a sky that went from pale blue to deep black with no gradation at all. Once the sun went down, Celia hung cedar boughs in the kitchen window and made a pie from the dried apples in the cellar, and Emmett rode to Canyon and came back with a length of blue calico that was clearly for her and tried to look as if it was not obviously a present. She accepted it with the straightest face she could manage. "It is for practical purposes," he said. "You needed fabric." "I needed no such thing," she said, "but thank you." He laughed. She kept the fabric carefully. Augusto and his family came on Christmas afternoon, his wife and 4 children, and there was a meal that took the whole table and the extra folding surface from the barn, and children underfoot, and Augusto's wife Maria making a point of speaking directly to Emmett in the way of a woman who has heard the whole story and has made her own assessment of it and found it acceptable, which Celia thought was more than generous and said so later. "She is a good woman," Emmett said, helping Celia wash up after the Ruiz family had gone home. "She was testing me the first hour." "Yes," Celia agreed, "she was. Did I pass?" "She was pleasant to you for the last 2 hours," Celia said. "What do you think?" He considered this and nodded. "That is enough for me." The winter was hard in the particular way that Panhandle winters are hard, not always with deep snow, but with a cold that is patient and thorough, and does not leave anything unexamined. They had the house and the stove and the full woodpile and the well-stocked root cellar, and they had each other, which made the long dark evenings something she found herself looking forward to rather than enduring. He was reading more in those months, which she had not expected. He had a small collection of books that he kept in his saddlebag, with the careful handling of things that had been carried far, and she had her own shelf, Daniel's books and a few of her own, and on winter evenings they sometimes read in companionable silence that she thought was one of the underappreciated pleasures of finding the right person, the ability to be quiet together without the quiet being a problem. She asked him about the books. He said he had learned to read late, at 20, from a woman in Kansas who ran a rooming house and who had taken it as a personal project when she found out he could not, and he said it with the particular combination of gratitude and mild embarrassment of someone who is not sure whether the story reflects well or badly on him. "It reflects well," she said. "Anyone who learns something difficult deserves credit for it." He looked at her over the book he was holding. "You are unexpectedly generous," he said. "I am telling you the truth," she said. "I tend to do that." "I have noticed," he said. "It is one of the things I most—" He stopped. "Say it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Most admire about you," he said. in a tone that suggested admire was doing a lot of careful work on behalf of a larger word. She got up from her chair and crossed to where he was sitting and put her hand on his jaw, and he looked up at her with that gray-green directness that she had once found unsettling and now found essential. "I love you," she said. The words came out plain and without ceremony, because that was how she meant them. He closed his hand around her wrist and held it against his face and said, "Celia," in a voice that had something broken open in it, something that had not been open before. "Say it or don't," she said, "but do not make that face at me if you don't mean it." "I have been trying to figure out," he said slowly, "how to tell you something that I am not sure I have said to anyone, not properly." His grip on her wrist was careful, like the way he held the deed copy, like the way he held her hand on the porch step. "I love you," he said. "I have been loving you with increasing certainty for the better part of 2 months, and it is a very large feeling. I have not known what to do with it." She sat down beside him on the arm of the chair, which was not quite wide enough for 2 people and required them to be very close, which was the intention. "You do not have to do anything with it," she said. "You just have to mean it." "I mean it," he said immediately, without any of the deliberation he usually gave his answers. "Then that is enough," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and outside the Panhandle wind was working at the corners of the house, and the fire in the stove snapped, and the lamp burned steady, and the night was very cold and they were very warm. He asked her to marry him in February, which in retrospect was a choice that could be questioned on grounds of timing. A cold gray February morning with ice on the water trough and a wind that cut through wool, but which she thought was actually entirely right for them, because they were not people who waited for ideal conditions. He asked her in the barn while they were breaking the ice on the trough, which was deeply unromantic and somehow exactly correct, and he said he had been thinking about how to say it in a better way but had decided that the better way was less important than the actual saying, and she had looked at him with the icebreaker still in her hand and said, "Yes." "You do not want more than that from the asking," he said. "I want you," she said. "I do not need a speech." He took the icebreaker from her hand and set it aside and kissed her in the cold barn with the horses watching and the February wind outside, and it was a very fine kiss. They were married in March at the small Baptist church in Canyon, in a ceremony attended by Augusto Ruiz and his family, Hollis Ford the circuit lawyer, and a handful of neighbors who had watched Celia Keene hold her land through a difficult winter and had come to see her happiness as a matter of community interest. Emmett stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that he had purchased in Canyon specifically for this purpose, and when Celia came up the aisle in her good blue dress, not the calico, that was for daily wear, but a deep blue wool she had made over the winter, he looked at her with an expression that everyone in the church could read perfectly. She said her vows with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him straight, and he said his with a steadiness that she had learned to recognize as his version of the same quality. Hollis Ford shook Emmett's hand afterward and said something quiet that made Emmett nod, and she later found out that Ford had told him he was glad to see Celia looked after, and Emmett had said that she did not need looking after so much as looking alongside, and Ford had said that was exactly right. Maria Ruiz cried. Augusto pretended not to notice. The spring of 1884 was one of those springs that the Panhandle occasionally produces, as if in apology for the winters warm and green, the buffalo grass coming up thick, the creek running full and cold and clear, wildflowers in the mesquite breaks that had no business being as beautiful as they were. Celia planted the kitchen garden in late March, and Emmett added to it without comment, putting in a longer row of tomatoes than she had planned, and she did not mention the fact that this was exactly what he had told her about himself. Wherever he stayed more than a month, he kept a garden, and the implication of permanence in those extra tomato plants was something she thought about when she was working the row beside his, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He was working for the Amarillo cattle operation properly now, the scouting and route planning work, which took him away for stretches of 5 or 6 days at a time, but always brought him back to the Keene homestead, which had become, quietly and by mutual acknowledgement, the place he was from now. He came back from those trips with the particular quality of a man who is glad to be home, which was something she had not expected to find as moving as she did. She told him she was expecting their child on a May evening when the sun was going down gold over the western flats and they were sitting on the porch, and he went very still for a moment in the way he did when something was too large for his usual self-possession, and then he turned to look at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded and said, "Really, really," she said. He was quiet for another moment, processing. Then he said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said. "I have felt well for several weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." He reached over and took her hand in both of his, the careful way he always held things he valued, and he did not say anything else for a while, but his grip was warm and his expression said everything the silence was holding. "A boy or a girl?" he said after a while, not as a question but as a thought he was turning over. "I cannot tell you that yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." And then, with a kind of shy gravity that she found enormously affecting, either would be wonderful." "It would," she said. The child was born in December of 1884, a hard birth that lasted 2 days and frightened Emmett badly enough that Augusto Ruiz had to take him outside and tell him firmly to stop pacing, or he would wear through the porch. The midwife from Canyon, a competent, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Hale, came out when Augusto rode for her and was there through the worst of it. And in the end the baby came into the world in the early morning, gray and then pink and then loudly, indignantly vocal, and was a boy. Emmett came in and sat beside Celia, and she put the baby in his arms and he held his son with the same deliberate, careful grip. He gave everything he valued firm enough to be secure, gentle enough to be safe, and he looked at the baby's face for a long time without speaking. She watched him. "Daniel," he said at last, and looked at her. She had not suggested it. He had arrived there on his own. "After your husband," he said, "if you want that." She felt tears on her face, which surprised her because she had cried very little in the past 2 years. "I want that," she said, "very much." Daniel Emmett Hartwell was a strong and healthy baby who made his preferences known with great volume and grew with the satisfying efficiency of someone determined to be larger as quickly as possible. His father was reduced to helpless amusement by him almost immediately, in the way that capable men sometimes are by very small children who do not care about capability at all and simply want to be held and fed and looked at. Celia recovered well, with the toughness of a woman who had been doing hard physical work for years, and by February she was back at full function, which she needed to be because the winter cattle required attention, and Emmett was away on a scouting trip, and little Daniel had opinions about everything and communicated all of them without pause. Augusto and Maria came in February with their youngest daughter, who was 3, and found baby Daniel fascinating in the way of small children who have found someone smaller than themselves. Maria sat with Celia while Augusto helped with the cattle, and they talked the way women who trust each other talk, plainly and about real things, and Maria said that Emmett seemed very different from what she had expected. "He is different from what I expected," Celia agreed. "He is different from what I expected him to be." "He looks at you," Maria said, "the way a man looks at a woman when he cannot believe she is real." Celia laughed at that. "It is a good thing," Maria said firmly. "Augusto looked at me the same way for the first 2 years. He still does sometimes. It does not get old." "No," Celia said, "it does not." Emmett came home from the scouting trip in February with a cold and a new rope and a tin of hard candies from a shop in Canyon, and he came through the door stamping snow off his boots and was immediately accosted by his son, who at 8 weeks old could not do much accosting, but communicated his requirement for attention very effectively. Emmett picked him up, and the cold went out of his expression in the way it always did when he held his son, replaced by something that was warm and slightly helpless. "He got bigger," Emmett said accusingly, as if Celia had arranged this without him. "That is what they do," she said. "I was gone 9 days. It was going to happen regardless of whether you were here to see it." He sat down with the baby on his knee and looked at him with the expression she had come to think of as his Daniel face, slightly awed, slightly amused, wholly smitten. "He looks more like you," he said. "He has your eyes," she said, sitting down across from him. He leaned forward and looked carefully. "He does. I noticed 2 weeks ago." He looked up at her with a smile that was wide and unguarded in the way that rare good things make people unguarded, and she thought she would carry that smile a long time. The years that followed had the quality of something that has been built well solid underfoot, reliable in weather, improving with use. The Keene homestead prospered in the particular way of land that is properly worked and genuinely loved. They added a new section of barn in 1886 and expanded the cattle herd in 1887. Emmett's scouting work evolved into something closer to route consulting, which took him away less often and paid more, and he was home enough to be present for the ordinary days that Celia had come to understand were the real substance of a life. Their second child came in 1887, a girl they named Rose, who arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, and made up for it by being the most determined person in the household almost from the first week, which was saying something given the competition. Daniel, who was 3 by then, accepted his sister with the pragmatic generosity of a child who has been well loved and has love to spare, and Emmett watched his 2 children with an expression that Celia thought contained several years of something he had not expected to have fully arrived. "You are happy," she said to him one evening, not as a question. He turned from where he was watching the children play in the last of the afternoon light, Daniel dragging a stick through the dirt, and Rose sitting on the porch step looking at everything with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's alarming directness. "Yes," he said, without the pause he usually gave important answers. "I am." She slipped her hand into his and he held it, and they stood in the October light and watched their children, and the land was theirs, and the evening was coming in gold and slow from the west. "Emmett," she said. "Yes. You know what I was doing the night you arrived," she said, "sitting at the table with the rifle." "I know," he said quietly. "I was planning to be alone in this," she said. "I thought I was going to have to be alone in it forever." He turned to look at her. "I am glad you were wrong," he said. "So am I," she said, "more than I can tell you." "You could try," he said with a slight smile. She turned and looked at him fully and said, "You are the best thing that has happened to me since I decided not to give up. And deciding not to give up was the best thing I ever did, and you are better than that. That is how glad I am." He was quiet for a moment, and then he put his arm around her and said, "That is enough," in the same tone she had used on the winter evening in the kitchen when he had told her he loved her, and she had said that was enough. She leaned into him, and they stood together while the sun went down over the Panhandle, which does not make excuses and does not apologize, and is large enough to hold anything you bring to it: grief, tenacity, the specific defiance of a woman with a rifle and a deed, and everything to lose, the long, crooked road of a man trying to become something worth being, and the life that grew up between them in the particular honest soil of a place where the wind says everything plainly, and the land keeps its own accounts. The land was hers and his and their children's. The deed was on the shelf in the kitchen, in a wooden box that Daniel had made and that Emmett had repaired when the hinge broke. And sometimes when she passed it, she thought of the night Emmett had set a folded paper on the porch step in the moonlight and held his hands up and said, "Just paper, Celia, just paper," and how everything had turned from there. She thought of Silas Greer, who was diminished and cautious now, and who had not come near her fence line in years, and of Whitfield Crane, who had left the territory for good in 1884, and of Judge Pemberton, who had quietly retired. She thought of the Fuentes family in New Mexico and hoped they were building something good out there. She thought of her neighbors, Augusto and Maria, who had helped when they could and who were still there, still good, still the best kind of people a person can have nearby when the world turns hard. And she thought of the night before all of it changed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and the rifle across her lap and the deed in danger and the dark pressing at the windows, thinking she was alone. She had not been alone. She just had not known it yet. The October of 1889 was 6 years out from that long night, and the Keene homestead, which they still called the Keene homestead out of a habit that had become affection, was very quiet in the evenings, the children asleep in the room they shared, the cattle settled for the night, the lamp burning on the kitchen table where Celia sat with her mending and Emmett sat with his route maps, their feet close together under the table the way comfortable people are comfortable. Outside, the Panhandle night was large and cold and full of stars, the way it always was, patient and enormous and indifferent to small human happiness. But inside, the lamp was steady and the stove was warm and the house held everything they had built, and Celia set down her mending and looked at her husband in the lamplight and thought that the people who told you the wild country was no place for a woman had not met a woman who had held her ground through the worst of it and come out the other side into this exactly this, which was everything. Emmett looked up from his maps and caught her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking at you." He held her gaze for a moment, and the lamp made his gray-green eyes warm, and he said, "I was thinking about what to plant in the spring garden." She laughed, the easy full laugh that had come back to her life so naturally over the past 6 years that she could no longer remember clearly the time when it had been absent. "Tomatoes," she said. "Obviously tomatoes," he said, "but I was thinking of trying something new alongside. Such as squash, maybe, if the ground will take it." She shook her head. "We will try it and see," she said, and picked up her mending. And outside, the night went on doing what nights do, and inside the lamp burned steady, and the deed sat in its wooden box on the shelf, and the land held its promises the way good land always does, quietly, without ceremony, for as long as you are willing to stay.